Good morning, First Christian. How are you guys doing today? Great, great. Hey, that was a great worship set. Thank you to the band and all the tech guys. Really appreciate that so much. Also, let's give a hand to all of our guys who get up here and do announcements. Because seriously, announcements are the hardest thing to do. I would rather preach a sermon than do announcements any day, because remembering all the details is just the hardest thing ever. So thank you, Mark, and thank you to all our guys who do that for us. We're going to be in John chapter 5 today, so if you would turn there, we will be there momentarily. I was watching something this week about Mike Rinder, and Mike Rinder was an interesting guy. He became, I think he was something like third in the hierarchy, third from the top in the hierarchy of Scientology. And he was in what's called the Sea Org. He started when he was very young. Apparently, when you get into the Sea Org, you have to sign a contract that you will do everything within your power to promote Scientology. And you sign a contract that is a contract for 1 billion years. You actually do. You sign a contract for 1 billion years. And he talks about being in that for like 30 years, and he said the only way that you ever get out of it, because they make it very hard to get out, he said the only way that you ever get out of it is when you decide nothing is worse than my life right now. I mean, think about how terrible that was to have been. And he talks about walking away from that at 52 years old and never having worked a day in his life in anything other than Scientology. Having to start over completely. He had no friends. He had no job prospects. He had no real skills that he could apply to another job. He had no relationships of any kind. He had nothing, and he had to start over the rest of his life to get out of this billion-year contract. Well, last week when we were talking, as we were going through this series on Death, Where Is Your Sting, we're talking about death and we're talking about heaven. And last week I talked about how at the end of the sermon that one of the things that we'll do is not just necessarily sit around on clouds and play harps like they do on the Saturday morning cartoons when they're in heaven. But what we'll be doing is we'll be remaking the world. Remaking really all of creation. That there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, and that it appears to be that there's going to be some kind of participation by us on that, and that is really the culmination of what it means to be a human. And the problem is that if that's eternity, it might sound like the billion-year contract is actually pretty short. Like, I know that as I say that that's what looks like heaven is going to be like, that you might say to yourself, well, gosh, that sounds like an eternity of just work. And that doesn't sound very good. So I want to address that today, and we'll start that in John chapter 5. If you want to turn there, we'll be there in just a second. But what I want to talk about today is rest, because the Bible is very clear that there's a restfulness or a rest aspect of heaven, and we want to understand what that is and what that looks like, because we can make a couple of bad mistakes when we start looking at our future with God in heaven. And one of the mistakes that we can make is that we're going to just sit around on clouds and be bored all the time. The other one that we can make is that there will be some kind of infinite labor for us. And so we want to address both of those. So if you will turn to me, John chapter 5, we'll start in verse 1. It says, "After this there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, 'Do you want to be healed?' The sick man answered, 'Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me.' Jesus said to him, 'Get up, take up your bed and walk.' And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked." Now this is an amazing miracle that Jesus just has given here on the Sabbath, on the day of rest. And what's fascinating here is that there was a belief that when these waters somehow moved, that if there was an angel that had done that, and if you got into the pool, if you were the first one to get into the pool, that whatever ailed you, you'd be healed. And this guy is saying, basically, because I'm lame, I can never do it. I can never accomplish my own healing. And so Jesus just simply tells him, get up, take up your bed, and walk. Just get up. And he does just that. He was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now, continuing on in verse 9, it says, now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. I mean, that's a good point, right? But he answered them, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. They asked him, who is the man who said, take up your bed and walk? They want to know, who's this guy that's telling you to break the Sabbath? Who's this guy that's done that? I mean, the fact that he was miraculously healed is secondary to the fact that somebody told him to take up his bed and walk. Now, he says, the man who healed me is the one who did this. That wasn't good enough. We need to find out who this is. They asked him, who is this man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? Now, the man who has been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. This guy, rather than being overjoyed at the healing, seems to be a little bit afraid, a little bit of, he seems to be maybe just a little bit intimidated by these religious leaders. And we'll see as the story goes on that there's a little more to it than this. Well, what are we going to find out about rest? Because really the problem here is that Jesus has commanded him to take up his bed and walk. He has healed him, but that breaks, according to the religious leaders, that breaks the Sabbath. He's not resting when this happens. Is this the correct understanding of rest, or is there a bigger understanding of rest? And in finding out that bigger understanding of rest, might we learn something about our own rest in eternity? Well, we're going to hopefully do that. We're going to do that by looking at three things today. We're going to look at holiness and toil, because those things seem to have a little bit of a connection. We're going to look at the meaning of rest, and then finally we're going to look at our heavenly rest. So let's first here look at holiness and toil. So one of the things that's very fascinating to me is that we can't respect a God who's not holy, but at the same time we can't help but be terrified of a God who is holy. We fear a holy God. He is perfect. And because he is perfect, his standard is far higher than ours. And it really is our lack of perfection in light of his perfection that is the problem and the reason that we are terrified of him. To the point that when even the angels show up throughout the Old Testament, even God's messengers have the response from the people of just utter terror. They just can't stand being in the presence of these creatures that are in the presence of a holy God. Leviticus chapter 22, verse 21 says something that's fascinating to me. It says, when anyone offers a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord to fulfill a vow or as a free will offering from the herd or from the flock to be accepted, it must be perfect. There shall be no blemish in it. So whenever you were offering something in the Old Testament to a holy and perfect God, if you were going to offer a sacrifice to that God, that sacrifice had to be perfect. It had to be blameless. Now the question is why? If it's just going to be sacrificed, what difference does it make? Well, in order to understand that, you have to understand the symbolism of the sacrifice. You see, God's the consuming fire that consumes the sacrifice. And if God is going to be united to that sacrifice, if he's going to consume that sacrifice, if God's going to be united to anything, that thing has to be perfect as God is perfect. Because if God's united to something that's not perfect, then that's a poor reflection of his own perfection that is antagonistic to his own perfection. You can kind of think about it this way. If you're a perfect painter and you paint an imperfect picture, then what happens? Well, you're not a perfect painter anymore. You're united to this picture. It's your work. And now it's not perfect. God is perfect in all of his ways and in all that he does. And so when God creates us and when God unites himself to us in covenant, we need to be perfect as well. And that standard of perfection, God's holiness, his set apartness in this completion and perfection, is a problem for us, and it creates great fear and anxiety on us. What other kind of God would we desire? We don't want an imperfect God. And in fact, that's maybe the worst of all possible scenarios. Do you guys remember the movie Bruce Almighty? Bruce, all of a sudden, God says, okay, you don't like the way I'm doing my job, you do it. And if you remember that, there's all these prayers coming in, and Bruce is getting frustrated with all the prayers, and there's a button there that says yes to all. Do you guys remember that? And so he just clicks the button, yes to all, and then all chaos breaks. You guys remember that? All chaos completely breaks out. Why? Well, because now what's happening is his interaction in the world, because he's trying to do God's job, and God is perfect and holy, and Bruce isn't perfect and holy, but he has the powers of God. Now everything's a disaster, everything's chaos, everything's worse than it was before. You see, we don't want a God who is not perfect and holy, but a God who is perfect and holy creates an insurmountable problem for us. Because we can never be close to him. We can never be in his presence. We can never reflect his glory because of our own imperfections. We can never be united to him in covenant. We were created to bear his image, and there is a pull of perfection in us. And that pull of perfection often results in us looking at ourselves very harshly. I don't know if this connects to anybody here, but you were made to reflect a perfect God. And when you don't measure up to that perfection, you can be harder on yourself than any person around you ever is. And in this, we see a lot of times the beginnings, the roots of depression, of a fundamental and deep-rooted sadness that goes all the way to the core of our being, because we know we are not who we want to be. And that frustration that we feel with ourselves. Why do I do these things? Why do I say these things? Why can I not get these things right? That can eat at us. And people who have their eyes open and are wise and see the state that they're really in experience this much more profoundly than others. And in fact, I think it's the reason in Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verse 18, it says, "For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow." If you're really going to know what's going on, if you're really going to have your eyes opened, you're going to have to be able to see the true faults in yourself. And because you are not living up to that perfection, it will create in you a profound sadness. Now, some people respond to that differently than others. Some people go into a deep depression. Other people decide, I am going to work my tail off to reach that perfection. I will never stop working. I will never stop moving forward. I will never stop trying. And so what happens is they cannot rest until they meet the standard. There is no rest to be found anywhere in their lives. They are constantly under the burden of needing to be perfect. Some respond with sadness, others respond with endless amounts of energy and no rest. Now, obviously, sadness is not rest, and neither is endless work. Well, you say, well, maybe the best option is then just to be blind and to not look at the standard and to not judge myself according to the standard of perfection. And the problem is that this seems like a good idea until it isn't. Because here's the problem. If bad is good, then I've just condemned myself to hell. Do you see the problem? If I remain blind to what is good, if I remain blind to what is perfect, then there's no chance that I have of escaping evil, because I can't even see it. And because I can't see it, I will always participate in it. I will always be connected to it. I can't free myself from an evil that I can't see. I was sharing in our Sunday school class this morning. I watched a video this week that was kind of a perfect encapsulation of this. A guy goes up, it was kind of those man on the street kind of interviews, and he goes up to a couple of women and he says, "Tell me something that you were told was true when you were younger." And one of the women, the older one of the women, said, "All men lie." I think that's probably true. I think all human beings lie, so therefore all men lie. Can't argue with that. She said, all men lie. And then he said, well, what's something you know to be true from your experience? And both her and the younger woman said together, all men lie. So what is something you were told to be true? All men lie. What is something that you've experienced? All men lie. And then he said something interesting. Between nice guys and bad boys, who do you want to date? And the answer was bad boys, right? Do you see the problem? Here's a fundamental human, and this is not just a problem with women, this is a problem with everybody, right? This is the problem. This is the fundamental human problem, is that we can't see or don't want to change our love for what is evil. And therefore, we condemn ourselves to endless evil. And so we find ourselves in this intractable problem of holiness and our need to be holy, and the amount of toil it creates is something that we cannot bear. I need to be perfect. I want to participate with God. How many of you guys want your lives to be better? Anyone? Okay. Well, in order for your life to be better, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to participate with what? Betterness. You're going to, ultimately, how much better do you want your life to be? Well, if you could have your life be perfect, would you not want your life to be perfect? Well, then you're going to have to participate with perfection. Can you do that? No. And so we have this problem of endless toil. And in fact, Matthew, verse 23, verse 4, or chapter 23, verse 4, this is the context of what's happening here. Jesus is talking to the religious leaders, and he says, they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their fingers. So what did the religious leaders do? They took an impossible task and they further defined it to make it more impossible. You have to rest on the Sabbath. Well, let's define what that means. Well, you can only walk so far, otherwise you're working. You can only do so many things. Like when Jesus is walking with his disciples and they're walking through the field that has grain there. So what happens is the disciples and Jesus, they grab the grains and then they rub them. Well, you can't do that because that's separating. And so they're harvesting and separating. You can't do that. And so they're breaking, because why? Is that what the actual... Did the law say that? No. The religious leaders have further defined this to make it more impossible. So now that we know the problem and we know the heaviness and the toil of the holiness that we're pursuing, of the perfection that we need to have, what happens is that we need to then look at what the meaning of rest is, because there is an answer to this problem. If we do participate in the recreation of the world, and we know that this is difficult because we're all engaged in the perfection of creation in some way. You have to go out and pull your weeds, for goodness sake, right? How is it that our eternity is not just a worse version of Scientology, just worse than a billion-year contract? Well, if we look back in history, what happens is that we see that when God created the world, that on day 7, He rested after His creation. God rested. God blessed the Sabbath. He made it holy. He rested from all His work. Now, what does this mean to rest? Well, in our modern culture, what we think of as rest is ceasing doing anything, right? But that's not really biblically what the idea of rest is. Now, there is the idea of ceasing some things, but really it's not as cut and dry as we might like it to be. God rests after His creation, not because He's tired, but because He's satisfied. And in that is a really important clue. Did you guys get that? God doesn't rest because He's tired. He rests because He's satisfied. He rests because the work is completed. He rests because it's at the state He wants it to be. He rests because creation is very good, He calls it. And when God says that creation is very good, He doesn't need to do anything more. He's satisfied with it, so He rests. And there is a huge clue for us to understanding rest. Rest is not the cessation of work because we're tired. It's the enjoyment of work because it's completed. And if we understand that, then we start to understand the Sabbath, we start to understand rest, and we will understand heaven. So let's get into that a little bit more. God's rest is not the cessation of activity. He doesn't go to sleep. God doesn't say, oh, done, nap time. We know that this is true. In fact, would it surprise you to understand that God continued to work? In John chapter 5, where we're at, starting in verse 15, the very next verse, let's do that. Let's go to John chapter 5, verse 15 and 17. It says that man, the man that Jesus had healed, went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. Now think about this. Jesus has healed him. They're like, who's the guy who told you to break the Sabbath? We want to find him. We want to find the guy who's responsible. It's like, when you trace the drugs back to the drug dealer. Right? Here's the guy who's committing the sin of carrying his bed, but we want to find the root source of this. Who told you to do this? And Jesus said, hey, man, don't sin anymore. You don't want anything bad or anything worse happening to you. And so this guy finds out it was Jesus, and then he runs to these religious leaders and say, it was Jesus. Not very wise. Kind of wonder what happened to that guy. This is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus. Because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. You see, the reason that they're persecuting Jesus is he's doing stuff that he shouldn't be doing on the Sabbath. And what could Jesus have? What defense could Jesus have for doing these things on the Sabbath? Okay, so he healed this guy. He could have said, hey, you're healed, but don't take up your bed and walk. Come back tomorrow and get it. But he didn't do that. Jesus has an explanation. And it happens in verse 17. It says, but Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. So the interesting thing is that when God rests on the Sabbath, it doesn't mean that everything's just stopped. It doesn't mean that God's just on vacation for the rest of eternity. It doesn't mean that God fell asleep. It doesn't mean that it's the blind watchmaker. God just walks away from his creation. God creates this and then he just leaves. He's the landlord that's just kind of gone, and who knows if he'll ever be back. That's not what that looks like. God is working. The Father is working until now, and Jesus is working. So what is rest then? Well, rest really is the enjoyment of covenantal unity. Rest is the enjoyment of covenantal unity. You see, in order to understand rest, we have to understand work. And in work, what you're doing is you're uniting something to yourself. You're making an imprint of yourself on that thing. Okay, so how many of you guys have ever done a home improvement project? Anyone here? Anyone done a home improvement project? How did it turn out? Perfect. How many of you guys have ever done a home improvement project that didn't turn out perfect? It did not turn out perfect. Okay, good. How many of you can look at that and go, yep, that's me? I can do that. I can look, I can see, and some of the things, I can see where I got impatient. I can see where I didn't know what I was doing. I can see where I kind of maybe gave up. I can see where I made a mistake. I can see where I was like, I'm done with this. Right? How many of you guys have any of those projects? Projects that maybe you'll come back to someday, but for now, you're done. So here's the thing. They bear the imprint of me. And that was the whole point, right? One of the things I did early on after we bought our house is I started to remodel the kitchen. And the kitchen is going to bear my imprint. I say to myself, this is what I want it to look like. This is how I want these things to be. This is where I want this thing. This is where I want that thing. This is what I want this color to be. Or this is what my wife wants this color. But whatever. But it bears your imprint. That's what work does. When Jesus was creating all things, he was making them in such a way that it reflected who he was. That's why he says it's good. And that's why at the end of creation, he's able to say it's very good, because Jesus will say there's only one thing that's good, and that's God. It's reflecting who he is. And so when you work, you make something, there's a covenantal unity. It bears your image. It has your imprint. That's what you're working to create. And then when you're finished working, you enjoy the fact that it is now bears your imprint. Right? Now, sometimes that enjoyment, we call this a covenant evaluation. Sometimes that covenant evaluation is completely joyful. I did it. Or maybe it's done. I don't have to mess with it anymore. But sometimes the covenantal evaluation is I like some of it, but I don't like all of it, right? So the thing is that though you enjoy that, that's what rest is. And when you truly rest, this thing has borne all of your imprint that it can. As an example, let's say that you're a songwriter and you're writing a song. That's work. You want this piece of music to reflect who you are. You want it to, it's the most of beauty, it's the most of strength, it's the most of power, it's the most of whatever it is you're trying to capture in that song that you can, and it's going to bear your imprint. And what happens is you write notes and you write different parts of it, and then you erase it, and maybe you don't like this, and maybe you don't like that lyric, and so you change it around, and you work at it and work at it and work at it. And what do you do when you're done with the song? You put it in a drawer, you lock it, and you go to sleep because you need to rest, right? No. What do you do when you're done with the song? What do you do? Jack, what do you do when you're done with the song? Play it, right. Why? Because that's the celebration of the song's completion. That's the celebration of the song's existence. That's the celebration of this covenantal unity. This is the song that I wrote. This is my song. That's what we do. Why after the fall does work become toilsome? You see, before the fall, Adam and Eve had the job of working and keeping the garden, but somehow after the fall, work became toilsome. Why? Because there's no covenantal unity with God, but instead there's separation from Him. And mankind, being a priest and a king, his job was not just to create something, but his job was to be a priest. And a king creates, but a priest joins. And so our creation had a special aspect to it, where in creation we join creation to God. But because we're no longer connected to God, we can't really fulfill this, and so work becomes toilsome. We cannot accept either our work or ourselves when it's impossible to unite to God, and so we have endless work. We cannot accomplish the union with God that we know we must. And this might sound very kind of esoteric, but it isn't. It isn't. If you create a song, do you want it to be perfect? Well, of course you do. But because you're not connected to God, it can't be perfect. And so there's always a toilsome nature to it. If you create a farm, do you want it to be perfect? Yes, but is it ever going to be perfect? No. If you create anything, do you want it to be perfect? Yes, but it's never going to be perfect? No. And so what do? You recriminate against the work, against creation, and you recriminate against yourself. You experience the difficulty of holiness. And this is because we are no longer connected to God. In Hebrews chapter 3, verse 7 through 12, it says, "Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness, where your fathers put me to the test and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was provoked with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God." Do you see the point here? They don't enter into God's rest. He's talking about the Old Testament people. They were wandering around in the wilderness, and God wanted them to enter something that symbolized His rest, and that was the Holy Land. And in order to do that, they had to have faith in Him. But remember, they didn't. They looked at the people who were inhabiting the land, and they said, we can't possibly win this fight. We can't possibly come against these people. We don't have faith in the command of God who says, you can do this. I will be with you. They didn't believe in the strength of God. They didn't trust God. There was no faith in Him. And so because of that, they could not enter the rest of God, and they fell away from Him. The point here is important for us to understand, and that is this, that union with God is where our rest is found. And in order for us to have union with God, we must trust God. Because what is union with God other than Him saying, this is the way to go, this is who to be, this is how to love, this is how to live, and us saying, yes, Lord, yes. The willingness of the clay to be molded by the sculptor. The willingness of the song to be written by the writer. The Scripture tells us that he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. And the question is, do you trust? Do you respond to the work of the Holy Spirit in your life? Do you follow His lead? Do you walk in the Spirit? Because ultimately what we have to understand is that there is a heavenly rest that awaits. There is a heavenly rest that awaits, and we needed to look at that. As we enter our last point here, I'm going to ask the band to come up. Because there's something that we need to discover about this, and they're going to help us to do that. The question before us here is, what kind of heavenly rest awaits us if we're going to be transforming creation? If we're going to have something to do at all in heaven, how can it be something and rest at the same time? How can heaven be a place where we participate with God in the judgment of creation and perfecting the universe and still be a place of rest? We talked about before how Hebrews compares the Sabbath rest with the promised land. And in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 10 through 12, it says this, and this is really important for us to grasp. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that He swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant, and when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You see, what's going to happen to the Israelites is they're going to go into a place that is a picture. It's a symbol of Sabbath rest. It's a symbol of heaven. They're going to go to a place that has houses that they didn't build. And it's going to be full of riches that they didn't earn, and it's going to have vineyards that they didn't plant, and it's going to have walls and towers put up that they didn't. They're going to be able to walk in there. Now, does that mean that they won't have any work or toil at all? No, but it means that the thing is built. All they have to do is participate in it. But notice something really fascinating about that passage. It says, when you get there and you experience that, then be careful. Take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Don't forget God. Because ultimately, the connection to God is what rest really is. This promised land is just a symbol. The reality is connection to God. And if you lose your connection to God, you will end up in slavery as you did before in Egypt. And that's what happens. They go into captivity because they forget God. You see, the promised land is a symbol, but the reality is this relationship with God where they come to be transformed into the likeness of God, where they reach that holiness and that perfection that God desires for them and that they desire for themselves. That is the point. Our inheritance is not land, but Christ. Unlike the Israelites, we're not going to inherit a symbol of rest. We inherit the true rest because we inherit a communion with Christ. We inherit a union with Him. We inherit something that is far beyond anything that they could have hoped for. We inherit the reality. They inherited the symbol. Jesus is united to the Father in perfection. The house is already built. And we go to live in Him. He has met the standard of perfection. He has met the standard of holiness. And we go to live in Him. And so, united to God with Christ, we have rest. So how is it that we can be building creation? How is it that we can be perfecting the world and not be tired? Because we talked about this idea that as we make our imprint on something, that it's toilsome. But notice there's something else in mind here. God is making his imprint on us. And when God makes his imprint on us, the result of that is that we make our imprint on creation. The reason that work is no longer toilsome is because our work is the result of his work in us. You see, when you are transformed on the inside, then you become like God. You become an image of him. You become an image bearer. You reflect who he is. And transforming the world is an act of joy. It's the singing of the song. We are his song, and the transforming of the world is the sound that it makes. It is the celebration. It is the joy. It is the heavenly rest. It is the enjoyment of everything that God desires for us. His union with us, his transformation with us, his imaging in us. The expression of that joy is the perfection of creation, and it is not toilsome. The celebration of him and his loving nature that enjoys perfecting all things is the celebration.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to his church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.